anxiety, based on his recent book and all the other contributions he's made over the many years he's been writing and working with people, and certainly working with us. We met very briefly in Greece at the World Symposium, and on the back of that, I contacted him to try to give us an opportunity to look at life-enhancing anxiety, of which this has been quite an example as far as I'm concerned. So I will get back off so I can contact those people who may still be waiting. Please, Kirk, I apologize, and please carry on in perhaps my absence. So Digby, can you hold the reins?
I'll do my best.
Thanks a lot.
First of all, thank you so much, Neil, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Society for bringing me on here. And perhaps it's good that we have begun a little belatedly, and we're being primed for a little life-enhancing anxiety, is my hope. Well, let me start with the crux right away. I define anxiety as the fear or terror of the unknown. Now, fear is generally seen as a fear of a specific object or person. But anxiety, in my studies and my own experience, really relate to that broader, deeper precariousness that we all experience at some level of a fear, and at a primal level, I'd say a terror of the unknown. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I also see anxiety as a call to the unknown. And I'd like to do a little free associating with the unknown. I think the unknown is also associated with what some call death anxiety, especially the group that might be called Beckerians, based on Ernest Becker's work, Denial of Death, and the terror management theory work that has been done in social psychology. I think it's more, in an experience near sense, associated with the groundlessness and helplessness of our human condition. And I certainly see that as related to death anxiety. But the question as to what death anxiety specifically is one for further inquiry. I don't think the problem is just finality. I think the problem is infinity. The radically unknown, the radically enigmatic and mysterious. And this groundlessness and helplessness is also associated with the terror of that which is other. Or as Otto Rank puts it, and I'm drawing to a great extent from Rank's work here, the terror of difference. So the difference that we come into when we're born. So Rank calls it the trauma of birth. I call it the drama of birth, because I don't think it's just trauma that happens to us. That's probably our initial shock and overwhelm, with the radical shift between relative non-being and unity with the mother, and by implication the cosmic mystery that we come out of, to sudden abrupt being and disunity, pandemonium. That cleavage, that crucible, is crucial in my view, as a template for virtually all future anxiety and trauma. It is the echo or the shadow behind, I believe, future anxiety and trauma. And that's partly what makes anxiety and trauma so difficult to work with, particularly if one is very raw with that experience. And I think, and I'll be talking to this later, I think it's one of the reasons that uncomfortable ideas, feelings, conversations can devolve so quickly because of that, the primal aspect of what's getting stirred there. Again, that sense of groundlessness and helplessness, shock and overwhelm that we experience when we're thrown, as Heidegger puts it, into existence, into life. And of course, the whole question is, how is one met at that point? How is one met by one's caretakers, by the culture and subculture one is born into? And I'm afraid one of the major problems for cultures like ours is that we're not very good at meeting people in this crucible. We're much better at giving people codes and rules and regulations and techniques and technologies to navigate our way through life, but not providing the vital equipment, the tools to work with this upheaval at the point of birth. But as I was saying before, I don't see it just as terrifying and overwhelming. I also see it as having an element of wonder and discovery. So anxiety can be a signal of imminent danger, physical danger. I think the evolutionists have a point here about this. It's a very adaptive signal, racing heart, the sweating, etc., bracing us to fight or flee. But in the absence of that imminent danger, and as you all know, in our contemporary world, there is a lot more of the absence of the imminent danger. There's much more of the symbolic danger. Anxiety can be a signal of liberation. So, and this is harking to much of Rollo May's work, which my book, Life Enhancing Anxiety, is an homage to in many ways. His book, The Meaning of Anxiety, which draws from Kierkegaard. But the point of anxiety as a signal of being on the edge of wonder, of discovery, of possibilities. Because just as the world is a mess, but when we come into it without equipment, if we can gain some equipment and tools, we can find some landing points to begin to see that mess can also mean a great deal of possibilities, a great deal of room to think, feel, express, intuit, imagine. So my plan is to speak a little bit with you and giving you an overview of this life-enhancing anxiety idea, maybe 10 more minutes, and then to open it up to general discussion and how this relates to your own therapeutic work, etc. I suppose I should define life-enhancing anxiety before I go on much further. Well, in tandem with what I just introduced, life-enhancing anxiety is the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. That's my formal definition of life-enhancing anxiety, philosophical definition. And I think it's critical to optimal depth experiential psychotherapy. Gaining that grounding, gaining those skills, that equipment, that enables one to be with the anxiety on a higher plane, if you will, the plane of, again, being on the edge of curiosity, of wonder, inquiry about one's struggle, one's situation internally as well as toward the world.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is a very powerful
Yeah.
Direction, I think, that basically can only come out of a very deep level of contact with oneself and between oneself and the other. Often that's needed. The interpersonal, facilitating the intrapersonal, as well as deepening of the relationship, and bringing the issue alive. So just to give you a thumbnail of where I'm coming from with this, very personally, it is very personal to me as well as professional. My own journey into life-enhancing anxiety began with profoundly acute terror. And that was when I was about 2.5, and my 7-year-old brother died of a series of diseases that attacked his heart. And this was a 10-month-long process. As many of you know, 0 to 2 may be a murky time, but it is also a very impressionable time. And perhaps some of the deepest imprinting on our psyche begins from that period. I'm certainly making that case with the trauma or drama of birth. So I was utterly decimated and thrown over that process. And the difference between my whole family system before he died and afterward was a radical cleavage, which I'm sure echoed that primal cleavage that we all experience when we come into this life. And so my safe and familiar world was ripped open to chaos. My parents did the absolute best they could. I love them dearly. They're both deceased now. But of course, and naturally, they were also torn. And for periods of time, my mother was apparently absent from the scene. I was raised in part by my grandmother, and my dad was quite busy. He was a school teacher at that time, a humanistic educator, actually. So there were some significant absences in my life in those early years, and I was floundering. However, my mother was also very psychologically minded. She was a television and radio spokesperson, interestingly. And she went into psychoanalysis to try to work with her breaking apart. Because this was, Kelly, my brother, was the star of her life. And partly I'm getting this information from a psychoanalyst that I saw many years later. And I asked for any notes that he had on me, and he was so generous in providing those. But that's another story. My mother was in psychoanalysis. She and her analyst agreed that it would be a good idea if I had an analyst. I was about 6 at that point, and I was in very bad shape, had a lot of rages. I was terrified of disease and death. My father thought I was losing it. I mean, he was taking notes on me, lack of contact with reality in some ways. terrified of monsters, witches especially, and you can imagine that that had some connection with my relationship to my mother and trust issues and terror of what does it mean for a child to die and how are my parents connected with that, and maybe even my mother, and of course my mother turning away from me, or what it felt like turning away from me at periods of time, I'm sure associated with fears of witches, of monsters. My father also exposed me to some movies, scary movies, when I was a very young kid. My mother didn't agree with that. They actually broke up, they divorced a few years after all of this as well, in an amicable way, but it was clear they had very different ideas of how to deal with my situation and their own lifestyles. In any case, you talk about terror of the unknown. In retrospect, that's what I think those monsters were really representing. Those were some kind of configurations that I was able to put through my imagination on the absolute free fall I was experiencing, at the bottomless pit that I was immersed in, without moorings, without places to grab. So maybe you could say that that was fear to some degree. I projected fear onto certain objects like monsters and night terrors that I had. In any case, this psychoanalyst, child analyst I had, probably helped to save my life, I would say psychically, at that early age, because as much as my parents tried and were psychologically minded, I think having that independent connection with somebody who was very seasoned, he was middle-aged, he was solid as a rock. I really don't remember anything that we said with each other, except that I think he did challenge me to ask questions about what was going on and to reassess what my situation was, what the reality was. My life as distinct from my brother's, etc. But I think the most powerful was him as a model of somebody who seemed to have been through a hell of a lot in his life, but still he was an extremely accomplished person, you know, a psychoanalyst, a physician, held me in a powerful way, had a little bit of a sense of humor. I don't remember too much of that, but I think there was somewhat of a liveliness to him. And these were all crucial for me. In what Winnicott would call the holding environment, I think that's very valid here. And Kohut would call the transmuting internalization, because my internalizations were extremely devaluing, terrified, nothing to grab onto, and down spiraling. And so his modeling of that holding and holding me when I was in my worst states, because he really encouraged expression, anything that I felt or said, wanted to say. My anger, he hung in there with me and helped me see that I could survive a lot of these extremely primal feelings. So that really was the beginning of my work with panic, acute anxiety. I had another therapy, which I described these in the book very much in detail. The other therapy, I believe, was based on a reactivation of this early trauma in graduate school. And it was with a wonderful, highly attuned existential analyst, I would say. She was existential and psychodynamic at my master's program in humanistic psychology at West Georgia. And this was back in 78. So I don't know, 40 some years now. 44 years or what have you. That was the most important, I would say that was the most important therapy of my life. And really helped me strengthen the tools and skills to work with my panic. I had a lot of panic attacks at that point. Just a brief note, it was a point at which my father was just about to marry a young woman who was a year older than me, and they had visited me, and I think that activated some archaic fears and sense of confusion, maybe to some degree. But even more than that, I was very far away from home. I was in an extremely different place, small town in Georgia, and I grew up in a big Midwestern city. And the department was a very radical humanistic psychology department, wonderful department. I learned so much being there, my master's program. But I was also overwhelmed at times, and I was away from family and a girlfriend, etc. And a very revered professor gently challenged me to work at the local mental asylum in the town. And that just ripped into me. I think a lot of it had to do with my fear of being crazy or going crazy at some level. And that activated a lot of, again, panic, anxiety, some perceptual distortions that I experienced. And I was at a loss until a classmate referred me to Ann Gustin, this existential therapist, analyst. And I started on a 9 or 10 month long journey with Ann, basically practicing the skills of becoming more present with her, more present within myself, practicing outside the sessions. And the notion of staying with, no matter what came up, to the degree I was able. And she was very incremental and supportive about helping me do that. It wasn't a forced kind of thing, but staying with all the way through to my most horrifying imaginings, fantasies, to my most exuberant feelings. That was the crux, I believe. And she helped me not just intellectually have a clearer frame and understand, much of what I was going through. That was a part of it too. Right? She helped me demystify some of the issues that I still felt confused about in my relationship to my parents, my mother, and around the death. But the bigger issue was helping me open to my whole body experience of the anxiety, and what I call a reoccupation project, helping me literally and figuratively reoccupy the parts of myself that I had cut off because of unfinished business around the primal terrors. And that has lasted a lifetime. I mean, I hope it's not a lifetime, but it's lasted, 44 years and counting. I was just so much more at home in my body. Again, not just in my head, not just behaviorally, but in my body. And then that was critical. And that's what I see as critical to this whole life-enhancing anxiety idea, is helping people, incrementally at their own pace to move from states of abject terror and paralysis to intrigue, curiosity about their struggle, and eventually some risk-taking, hopefully, between them and their therapist, within themselves, in opening to places and feelings that they wouldn't open to heretofore, and in the outside world, and coming to a place where that chaos and that groundlessness, that abyss, becomes a new field of possibility, playfulness, creativity, at least it was for me, helped me open to those capacities in myself. And I will say I was encouraged to be creative, especially by my father, who did his dissertation eventually on creativity in kids. So I had some wonderful benefits. But again, being able to open up to possibility, creativity, to interest in and engagement with people who are different and other. And that led to a lot of my interest, which is very intensive now, in bridge building dialogues between people of very different cultural and political backgrounds. But how enriching that is to connect with people from different backgrounds, to travel, and to connect with my wife, actually, who was of a completely different background than me. I grew up pretty much secular Jewish in an all-Catholic neighborhood, which is another interesting story of mine. My wife is Lithuanian Catholic, first generation. We had some major background differences, but I'm sure that a lot of the work that I had done in that therapy helped me to open to her world, and the work that she did and the work we did in couples therapy before we got married helped a lot with that sort of coming into more of the wonder and curiosity place and place of discovery and learning about each other, rather than the labeling and presumption about each other. So life-enhancing anxiety is significant for good therapy on so many levels, it seems to me, but maybe ultimately on helping one to create an inner home that one can always return to, that's been time-tested and emotionally tested in big ways. I should also mention that I was able, as a young man, soon after my master's, to work in psychiatric emergency settings and at a state hospital full-time for a year for my postdoc. Those were really big milestones for me, because I was facing very directly the kinds of terrors or echoes of terrors that I was caught by and constrained by just a few years earlier. And I guess the other point I'd like to make quickly is how life-enhancing anxiety is the seedbed for a sense of awe toward living. I see the sense of awe toward living as at least one important culminating outcome of good depth experiential therapy. And if you think about it, that therapy is a staging ground for the sense of awe. The sense of awe, as I define it, is the humility and wonder or sense of adventure toward living. And it means coming into one's whole bodily being, one's whole bodily experience to the degree possible, so that one can range within and that one can be with one's most vulnerable feelings, again, to the degree possible, as well as one's boldness and capacity to venture out and take risks. So it's a wonderful paradoxical sort of sensibility that I believe reflects the experience of fuller living, more vital living, where one has an inner freedom that's priceless. And so the therapeutic work that I did, and of course other work in this field of existential psychology, philosophy, has been just a godsend in a sense for me. It's been a treasure trove in helping me with my own journey toward life-enhancing anxiety. So I think I'll stop there. Your partner, however you want to put that, is so critical to that hope. How they're holding that hope, how they're staying with whatever it is that you're bringing up, and able to be with it and still be more than it. I mean, that's really, if you want to put it in a sentence, it's coming into the more of who we are. And that more, if you're present, is continually unfolding. And of course, hope is a part of that, as well as a sense of hell can be part of that. But as long as you're in the process, and new things are unfolding, new things are emerging. I think of Stephen Hawking too. How did he have any hope? How did he get beyond an identification with his ALS, where I believe he's a quadriplegic and he could barely speak. So he spoke through a voice activation machine. And yet he seemed to be really turned on by questions about the universe and his astrophysics investigations. So how does one develop that inner freedom? These people set the bar, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Kirk.
Yes, it looked like somebody else.
So please raise your hand, or if you want to just literally raise your hand if you have questions or you'd like to say anything in connection with what Kirk's been talking about.
I think Emmy's got her hand up. I can't find my hand button myself, but Emmy's got it.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. Emmy.
Well, thank you, Kirk. You know how much I like your work and how like-minded we are. Of course, going back to Heidegger, he would take the view that all anxiety was ultimately about death. And your history, your experience in your first 10 years of your life was about death, wasn't it? You were confronted with the death of a child that could have been you, that was your brother, probably your role model. I don't know if you can remember.
Yeah, I have a body memory of that, for sure.
You do?
He was
Yes.
a good kid, yeah.
And you saw him waste away, as it were, and that wasn't hidden from you, was it?
Well, somewhat. I mean, because he was in hospitals for many months.
Yes. But then you had that feeling of the hospital and parents going there and you being neglected on your own, thinking about it.
Yeah.
So were you aware of that? That's what I'm wondering about. When you were this small, were you like panicking about the idea that you would go the same path and that this was inevitable, as it were, as if the role model were showing you that life is short and dangerous and you're going to get eaten up by something nasty and you're not safe? Is that how it felt?
Very much so. In fact, I sometimes jest with people about midlife crisis. I don't feel like I really experienced a midlife crisis. And when I go back, I think, well, that's because I experienced a midlife crisis at 2.5 to 6 years old. My illusions about life in the world were utterly shattered at that point.
But at a time when you were absolutely not equipped to bear that feeling and had no trust that there would be anything beyond that worth having.
That's right. And that's where my parents, to the degree they could, and this analyst were so critical for me. But I think
presumably initially your parents had abandoned you a little bit. You didn't just lose your brother, but you lost their love and their attention because they were absorbed by this terrible, terrible event with their firstborn. Was it their firstborn?
Yeah. Yes. And I actually have my psychoanalyst notes, as I mentioned before, and
yeah,
such an amazing window into a child's life. But
your life.
My life, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
He revealed some things that I wasn't actually aware of. Like he said that my brother was the star in the family and to my mother in particular. And so, and something about me being secondary at that time.
Oh gosh, yes.
So I don't know what really that's all about. My mother and I did get a chance to talk some about times back then, but it was very difficult for her to go into much. And in any case, overall, I felt her love, but it took quite a bit of struggle, I think, for both of us to get to those places. And probably the inner work we were both doing helped a lot. In fact, the analyst said that about her as well, that her psychotherapy was extremely important.
But she wanted to understand and she wanted to retrieve you, not lose both her sons.
Yes, she did.
And you knew that. Do you remember knowing?
Well, I knew that, but I also felt her ambivalence too, which is understandable about losing the one in a sense, and then here's this other.
Yes. The second best one.
And how does one position oneself in that crazy situation?
Absolutely.
Probably picking up on that. I'm sure I was picking up on a lot of different vibes.
Yes, you must have had huge concern for your mother as well, seeing her depressed and absent and wondering what was happening to her.
Yes.
Do you know whether you were afraid she was dying too?
I certainly was afraid of losing my parents.
Yeah.
Like if I was very clingy, I think I had that experience, terrified of being lost. And I remember one episode with my father where we got mixed up about where to meet in a building, and I was a pretty young kid, and I was just in total panic. Like things whirling around me. So, yes, I mean,
because you couldn't find your way, because you didn't trust that he would be there.
Yeah, all of that. So you started by talking about death anxiety. I think it really needs to be unpacked. What do we mean by death anxiety? And again, I come back to that sense of utter helplessness and without any moorings that represents it. And it's radically other. It's radically different than that passive receptive place, or whatever you want to call it, the safe and familiar. And yeah, so that is the huge challenge. How do you come into that larger space?
But the real challenge for us as therapists is to understand how we can help a child or an adult, for that matter, who is caught in that unmoored place
Yeah.
to find their way on
Yeah.
those rough seas and
Yes.
to find their way back into a safe harbor, when in
Yeah.
fact there isn't a safe harbor for them. That's the hard thing, isn't it?
It is, and
Can
that's why.
only thrive on the anxiety if there is a safe harbor.
Yes, yes, but it's all relative, because I would call even the achievement of a safe harbor a ground within groundlessness. Because once you've been through these kinds of foundation shaking experiences, you realize that we're always on that sea, or at least that's my experience.
Mm.
That sea is filled with, you could call it subconscious perils, challenges, unknowns. It's just that you can swim a lot better, and you're attuned to the waters much more, and you've got community that's with you, and you can expand out and deepen your dives and expand out within that sea. So I call it ground within groundlessness. I think that's the greatest achievement of great therapy, is helping person find that, again, inner home amid the whirlwind.
Yes, and amidst the potential monsters at the bottom of the sea, right?
Yes.
So
yeah.
you were afraid of those monsters too, and you
Yes.
had to find a way to befriend them, or learn to trust them, or feel you were one of them, or that you could make a relationship with them. It wasn't about making yourself just safe from them, was it?
No,
That
no.
never does, because they're always going to come cracking through.
That's
You've
right.
got to actually change them. You've got to change them into something that is good to you rather than dangerous to you. You've got to integrate it.
Exactly.
How on earth did you do that as a child?
I think I was helped by some very special witnesses who had that knowledge, that wisdom, that this wasn't just about rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, so to speak, or, changing my thoughts or changing my behaviors, or even taking medicine. Of course, at those days, 1960 or so, the medicine was not, pushed like it is now. And I really wonder what I would have been like if it had happened now. But
Thank goodness, yes.
these people, and especially that analyst, they had a wisdom about how I needed to find ways of opening to these monstrosities without falling apart. And of course, his support, my parents, understanding, all help that. What you're saying about the embracing, I think this is also where our work is so important, because I believe we bring, again, more of a whole-bodied experience to the encounter with our struggle, because these are not things that can be boxed in interpretations or words only. We need to make room for one to experience it, and feel it and sense it, imagine it. Otherwise, I fear that the healing is more on a thin veneer, and you're not getting to the foundation. And I think this is actually the problem with our world today in many ways. We have so many seductions to cover things over and to skate along because of our technology and our emphasis on the quick fix and instant result model for living, that we don't see what is seething within, and what needs to be addressed at the foundations. That's why I feel we're really important too, as people who have some skill, hopefully, at working with those very different, even contradictory places. with our patients.
I'm just wondering, Kirk, if some other members of the audience might have some personal experience of giving up on the safe harbor, or might want to share a bit of, from your
Jeremy has his
ideas.
hand up and would like
Yes,
to.
What a joke.
Jeremy, please.
Yes, I came a bit late to the meeting tonight, so I missed out a fair chunk at the beginning, so I might have missed out some details that are quite relevant. But I'm just thinking about this anxiety as a kind of a call to action for some of us. It's very disempowering for many, but I know for myself and certain clients that I work with, I mention anxiety to one person, and he said, no, I just feel excited. And excited to do something, to take action.
Uh-huh.
And I think many people I work with, myself included, we've had multiple losses, near brushes with our own existential collapse. Until somehow we do kind of get through it. And I wonder, like, when I kind of experience anxiety, it's always about, what have I got to do? I've got to take some action. I've got to do something. It's almost like I've got the predator in the room with me. I must take action to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. So for you, it's a signal for action of some kind.
Signal for action.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Obviously, some circumstances are completely overpowering, where inertia sets in. Then you're left with the paralyzing type of anxiety.
Right.
But in the kind of title of what I read for this meeting, I was thinking about it as a kind of life-giving force. That you can just be,
yeah.
I anticipate this event's going to happen, this thing's going to happen to me. What do I need to do? I need to brace for impact? Do I need to kind of fight it? Do I need to run away from it?
Mm-hmm.
What action do I need to do?
Those are great questions. In a way, anxiety is a euphemism for mobilization of some kind.
Yeah.
How is one going to mobilize? And in some cases, of course, with imminent threat, especially physical threat, the mobilization is bound to be much more, constricted and maybe even instinctual to a degree, survival based.
There is survival-based inertia. But
But
part of it also is that at what part of our life, because obviously at parts of our life we're just overwhelmed by the stimulus and we're powerless.
Yeah.
And that's very paralyzing. And many people carry that as a kind of script for life, that when I encounter something that invokes anxiety, I just go into paralysis.
Paralysis or skimming surfaces, I would say. Doing everything one can to avoid any hint of that contrasting element.
I see some other people are raising their hands, so I'm going to give over to other people.
Anyway, thank you for that input.
I can see. Oh, Yanis, please.
Neil.
Hello.
Hello. Kirk, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I couldn't help but recall reading Kierkegaard and how he describes this angst, this dread, when I think he's in a clearance in Denmark somewhere, and he realizes that there are potentially 3 ways that he can go. And I think for me it was interesting because it was the feeling more than anything else. But I think what you're describing is beyond the feeling. It's as if what we're saying is that, okay, so if I take the wrong turn, the worst that can happen is I can always come back and retrace and potentially try another way. And it's that curiosity and getting beyond that feeling of dread. And that keeps coming up for me because when I see clients, it's always the same. It's that fear of fear, as Digby pointed out. It seems to be coming up quite a lot. So I'm wondering whether what we're saying here is that the only way that we can get over the fear is not to have the fear at all, and to kind of look at something as if the potential to learn something new, to discover something new. So what we're doing is we're removing that fear, that of dread, that potentially that turning might be the wrong one when it could be the right one. Does that resonate, or does that make any sense?
It resonates, but I would use a different phrase, different phrasing around eliminating the fear. I don't believe I eliminated the fear, and I don't think many of my patients who have come into their own more have so much eliminated the fear as learned to coexist with the fear. In other words, that the fear, radically unknown, is a human problem, aside from whatever was stirred up because of their traumas in the background. And one is aware of that, one is very humbled by that. But it's just that it's this and that, rather than only this. So it's coming into the more of who one is, rather than discarding these pieces that have been so menacing. And how to come into that more is the huge challenge. And I do believe that clients' desire and capacity to go to these deeper places is critical in terms of how much they're willing and able to work at the deeper levels of healing. Not everybody's willing or able to. But I think it's incumbent on those of us who are existentially oriented to be available to all our clients to step into that realm on the chance that they may be ready at a certain point to connect, again, more at the experiential level between us and within them. I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question or is more of a comment, but certainly I'd raise a question about eliminating the fear. I'm not sure we can do. I'm not even sure that's such a good thing. That almost sounds like it could move toward this transhumanism idea that we could become, quasi robots, and then we have no fear. But what kind of life do we have?
I think it was more situational fear as opposed to removing fear full stop. It's about that specific fear.
Yes. Okay, I get that more. And certainly, yes, being able to work with that fear and minimize it, or not allow it to take over one's life. I'm right with you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Kirk, Nigel has his hand up. Would you be happy just to end with asking or listening to what Nigel might be offering or questioning? Is that okay for you?
Yes, and actually, if you want to take a little extra time, I can do that.
That's very good of you. Thank you. Thank you. Nigel, would you like to?
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks, Neil. Thank you, Kirk. Thank you very much for your vulnerability and all that you have shared today. It resonated a lot with me. Everything you said really resonated a great deal, and I just wanted to say a few things based on what came up for me as you're speaking. One of the terms you talked about, radical cleavage, and it made me think, I wonder whether that is either an important or a necessary experience for us who later become therapists, that we go through something like that. And it brought up a memory for me, not a particularly traumatic memory, but more of an amusing memory that I first wanted to share, which is, I remember being about 7 or 8 at school, and I was not one of the fast runners in my class. I was about halfway. There were the fast kids and there were the slightly slower kids, but I was never the fastest. And we had this big hill in the playground, and one day all of the boys decided they were going to lock arms and run down this hill. And I found myself caught up with my arms locked between a couple of other kids, running down this hill, and then getting faster and faster and faster. And eventually it got to the point where I was going as fast as I had ever run. And then I realized they were taking me faster beyond that. And I really thought for a moment I was going to fall or something. I didn't know how I was going to cope with this. It was going faster than I could go.
Yeah.
To the point that they were sort of carrying me in a way.
Mm.
My legs were moving.
Mhm.
And I managed to get to the end of that field that we were running down.
Yes.
And some weird thing happened whereby subsequently I was now one of the fast runners in the class, and I could keep up with them. And even from that age, I put it down to that moment that that was the cause of it. And as though I had to be taken to the edge of something, and then a little bit beyond it.
Yeah.
And by stepping a little bit beyond it, I grew, I developed in some way. And I wonder with some of these experiences, like the experience you've had, and the experience, I guess, like most of us therapists have had in different ways during our life and interpreted in different ways, whether we're also we have to be led to the edge, and we have to be, you talk about home and homelessness, like, the phrase that home has left me. I found myself in a position where home has left me, where I am no longer within that comfort zone anymore. And I cannot do anything to change it in that moment. I have to endure it, and I have to survive it. And know that I can survive it, and somehow struggle and find a way through this experience. And then that grants me something that can be of help to others, perhaps. If I learned from it, if I work through it in some way. So I kind of wanted to share that with you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And the idea that you were carried also feels very much like a holding environment that helped you internalize a new perspective toward yourself.
Yes.
And also the idea of touching on an edge that was untouchable before, how powerful that can be for the rest of the therapy or the rest of the healing. The momentum that brings somebody is so different than the momentum going the other way, it seems to me, and can be a touchstone, like you say, that can be opened further, and also a confidence, right? Because now you've got a sense that you overcame something. It's part of the brickwork that you have now. So all those things feel very powerful. And as to your point about therapists, I'm sure that many of us, especially those of us working at the depth area, have had what might be called edge experiences or limit experiences that, if not transformed our lives, had a significant impact on our lives. I'm not a believer, like some therapists used to say, that the client can only go as far as you as a therapist have gone on their path. But I do think that to a great extent, the client can only go as far as the therapist has some analogous experience to what the client has been through and has walked somewhat down the roads of those edges that the client's on. And I do feel that having worked at the state hospital and in psychiatric emergency and graveyard shifts all helped me to have more ballast, if you will, or a much wider range of folks that I see. But most fundamental was my own work.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I make one more quick point, which is another strong point of resonance, which is something I use with my clients, and that's about what you describe, but in a different way, and it's about being with anxiety. And I describe it as learning to be a pilgrim. As in, a pilgrim is someone who has left home, is usually on a mission, usually on a journey, often lost, hungry, scared.
Yeah.
But also within them is something very powerful, because they're doing something really important and meaningful, where there is something concrete and knowing about what they're doing. And so there's a being at home in their homelessness, and learning to be at home in one's homelessness.
Yes.
Or in other words, learning to be a pilgrim,
Yeah.
which is my version of something that you were touching on, I think, earlier.
I think it's a beautiful metaphor for what I'm speaking about. And if that pilgrim can meet a fellow pilgrim who's helpful along the journey, so much the better often, a fellow traveler. Yeah, very much like opening to new terrain.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And that brings a spiritual dimension too, which I feel is very relevant to this conversation.
Yep.
Our relationship to existence in an even broader way.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you.
So thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Nigel. Can we just have one last question, perhaps, or contribution? Carolina, would you like to continue, please?
Thank you very much, Kirk. I'm really touched by the calmness, the way how you talk. It was a real sense of meeting, although online, but it really, your presence was very obvious, and the journey behind. And in correspondence, actually, to what you, Nigel, said, to me, this homelessness, it can be equal to breathlessness, although in different contexts. But like you, Kirk, mentioned, and I agree with Emmy, that this terror of your childhood consume you. So the breathlessness was very present within your absence, in a way. And I just... you mentioned Rollo May, or Emmy mentioned Heidegger, both dealt with that anxiety, or Friedrich Nietzsche, or many others, well known or not. I just wonder, is your journey going more inwards and into stillness, into this pilgrimage of being with oneself, or more relational, outwards, and integrating all aspects?
I think it's both. And I feel very honored or privileged to have been afforded pathways to work at both levels. My therapist, and particularly that last one in graduate school, was very relational. And she helped me work very much in the here and now between each other. And as you can imagine, all kinds of themes came up between us. Someone might call it transference, countertransference. I would call it all part of the rich context, past and present. It supported me to come into a relational home, if you like, as well as forming new internalizations in myself, because that was a lot of the work too, was intrapsychic. And of late, I've moved out of the cubicle more or less. I still see patients, but I really love the people I see, but it's very much limited, and I'm more involved. My sort of leading edge now is the relational. It's about promoting these bridge building dialogues between people of very different backgrounds, and it's just the relational, I think, is so important. Both are so important at this time, in our collective and individual lives. And breath makes a lot of sense to me too. the translation of breath is spirit, right? Or inspiriting, taking in the spirit. And certainly full breathing brings one more into one's whole bodily being, as opposed to being at the surface. And it's also aliveness,